Some boomers genuinely believe financial wisdom peaked sometime around 1973, back when houses cost a nickel and avocado toast wasn't a moral failure. And just when you think their money advice can't get any weirder, trust me, it absolutely does. 1. Boomers insisting that the secret to wealth is just stop buying coffee hits peak comedy when someone confidently claims millennials could retire at 30 if they simply abstain from lattes, as if Starbucks is personally siphoning 401k balances into a secret vault. The math behind this masterpiece of thrift usually involves the belief that coffee costs roughly the same as a used Toyota every year, and that compound interest multiplies faster when fueled by pure misery, resulting in a lecture where a $6 cappuccino is treated like an act of economic terrorism while ignoring that the advice giver once bought a 3-bedroom home for the price of modern brake pads. Watching this logic unfold feels like witnessing someone blame national debt on scented hand soap. Yet they deliver it with the calm authority of a financial guru who truly thinks the path to generational wealth begins with caffeine abstinence and ends with an early grave where mortgage payments no longer matter. 2. Nothing captures boomer financial philosophy quite like the stern proclamation that the only investment anyone will ever need is a good savings account, usually said with the kind of gravitas reserved for medical breakthroughs, as though depositing $5 a week into a 0.01% interest account will magically turn into beachfront property by the time a millennial hits retirement age. The advice is often accompanied by nostalgic tales of interest rates from the 1980s, told with such intensity that you can practically smell the Reagan administration, while ignoring that modern savings accounts grow slower than houseplants in a windowless basement. Still, the speaker radiates confidence, convinced that millennials would be wealthy if they simply embrace the sacred ritual of putting money into a bank that rewards loyalty with a yearly return smaller than the cost of a parking meter mistake, all while declaring this to be the cornerstone of responsible adulthood rather than a financial museum exhibit preserved in amber. 3. One boomer favorite suggests millennials should just buy land because they're not making more of it, typically delivered with the breezy enthusiasm of someone recommending a 2-for-1 coupon, while completely overlooking that the cheapest parcel within 200 miles of civilization now costs what entire towns were going for in 1962. The advisor often gestures broadly, as if unpurchased land simply floats in the air waiting for someone with $48 and a dream, ignoring zoning laws, property taxes, and the small detail that most millennials can't even afford a parking spot, let alone several scenic acres. Yet the recommendation persists, wrapped in the belief that land ownership is the universal equalizer, even though modern listings read like satire. Rustic 0.5 acres, includes 3 feral goats, no road access, cash only. Meanwhile, the boomer dispensing this wisdom usually lives on property bought back when real estate agents accepted sandwiches as down payments, making the entire suggestion feel like a financial ghost story from a parallel universe. 4. Advising millennials to just work overtime until you get ahead sounds almost reasonable until the speaker reveals their definition of overtime, which is basically living at work until they pry your lifeless body out of a swivel chair. The suggestion is tossed out casually, as if extra hours magically appear like bonus levels in an old video game, ignoring modern burnout rates, unpaid labor expectations, gig economy chaos, and workplaces that consider complimentary pizza an acceptable substitute for raises. The boomer offering this insight usually prides themselves on a 40-year career in a company that still existed in the same form last Tuesday, blissfully unaware that millennials often juggle 3 side hustles and an anxiety disorder just trying to approximate stability. Yet this advice is spoken with triumph, as though grinding nonstop is a badge of honor rather than a medically documented path to becoming a haunted office cryptid whose sole nourishment is fluorescent lighting and stale break room air. 5. The immaculate suggestion that millennials should stop renting and buy a house already lands with the force of a cosmic joke, uttered by someone who purchased their first home with a handshake, a coupon, and 2 months of savings back when property listings were basically written on cocktail napkins. The advisor usually insists ownership is simply a matter of discipline, conveniently forgetting that the modern housing market operates like a dystopian reality show where bidders must offer both kidneys and a compelling backstory just to schedule a viewing. They then wax poetic about the stability of owning land, while ignoring the part where millennials are defeated by down payments larger than the GDP of small islands. Meanwhile, the speaker marvels at why young people can't just get in the game, as though housing isn't currently a high-stakes gladiator arena where every starter home has 47 competing offers, 3 cash investors, and at least one tech billionaire redecorating it into a robot storage facility. 6. Some boomers genuinely believe the golden path to financial security is "just ask for a raise," said with the breezy tone of someone suggesting grabbing lunch, blissfully unaware that in many modern workplaces, asking for a raise is treated like requesting classified missile launch codes. They describe a past where raises appeared annually like migrating birds, fluttering in to reward loyal corporate service, while millennials navigate offices where requesting fair compensation results in performance reviews, mysterious budget, shortages, or team-building workshops designed to distract from wage stagnation. The boomers' confidence is unshakable, as though employers still reward initiative instead of silently noting it on a spreadsheet before outsourcing your job to a robot. Meanwhile, the advice giver fondly recalls marching into a boss's office and emerging with a raise, a promotion, and maybe a fruit basket, producing a story that feels more mythological than anything involving dragons or enchanted swords. 7. The all-time classic, "Stop wasting money on food delivery and just cook at home," arrives as though millennials are out here commissioning private chefs instead of trying to avoid collapsing from exhaustion after a day spent navigating capitalism's obstacle course. The advice assumes that groceries remain affordable, that kitchens are spacious, and that anyone has time to julienne vegetables at 10 p.m. after commuting through a traffic jam that felt like a slow-moving existential crisis. Boomers often describe home cooking as a budget miracle while glossing over the modern experience of paying $18 for a bag of produce that spoils faster than their belief in climate science, all while imagining that millennials are blowing fortunes on pad thai instead of simply trying to survive another evening without starting a grease fire. Their nostalgia frames cooking as a serene domestic ritual instead of the frantic multitasking gauntlet it has become. 8. The suggestion to pay with cash so you feel the money leaving your hand belongs in the Museum of Economic Folklore, especially when delivered by a boomer who hasn't physically touched cash since the Bush administration. The advice hinges on the idea that emotional pain is a budgeting tool, and that the tactile sorrow of handing over a 20 will somehow stop millennials from buying necessities. Meanwhile, modern life has become so digitized that paying cash feels like performing historical reenactment. Yet boomers insist it's the key to self-control, ignoring that most millennials don't even live near an ATM that doesn't charge a fee resembling a ransom demand. The irony is that the same advisors are often obsessed with earning credit card travel points, turning the whole lecture into an elaborate exercise in financial hypocrisy that could easily be mistaken for performance art. 9. The culinary fever dream known as "never buy brand-name groceries when generic tastes the same" is a boomer anthem, delivered with unwavering certainty, despite decades of evidence that generic cereal tastes like edible packing material and that off-brand peanut butter has the texture of industrial caulk. The advisor typically insists millennials wouldn't be broke if they simply embraced budget-friendly alternatives, ignoring the tragic reality that some generics cost the same as the originals and others contain mysterious flavors not found in nature. Meanwhile, the boomer extolling the virtues of generic, everything often stocks their own pantry with brand-name coffee, brand-name snacks, and the exact shampoo the commercial told them to buy in 1987, creating a paradox so thick it could be sold as store-brand pudding. 10. Boomers often deploy the sage advice, "You don't need therapy, just get a hobby," merging financial thrift with psychological negligence in one breathtaking sentence. The suggestion implies that emotional trauma can be cured by gluing seashells to photo frames or assembling a birdhouse that collapses at the first gust of wind. The advisor often brags that nobody needed therapy in their day, conveniently omitting the decades of unresolved feelings, explosive family dynamics, and emotional repression stored like hazardous waste inside multiple storage units. According to this logic, millennials could apparently save thousands simply by cross-stitching their way out of generational trauma, as though anxiety disorders dissolve on contact with a moderately interesting craft project. The entire idea radiates the same energy as telling someone to cure a broken leg with positive vibes and a subscription to a gardening magazine. 11. Nothing showcases boomer confidence quite like declaring that millennials should just keep the same job for 40 years, as if loyalty alone produces pensions, stability, or affordable healthcare. The advice is rooted in an era when companies rewarded longevity rather than using employees like disposable printer cartridges. The speaker often reminisces about climbing a corporate ladder that no longer exists, a sturdy wooden structure replaced long ago with a greased fire pole leading directly into bankruptcy if one missteps. Yet they speak with conviction, insisting millennials lack grit, ignoring the reality that staying in one job for too long today can permanently cap income and leave workers obsolete faster than outdated smartphones. The suggestion becomes a time capsule from a lost world where promotions weren't fought for like battle royale matches and where HR didn't measure productivity using algorithms that would make Orwell sweat. 12. A particularly baffling piece of wisdom claims that millennials should never use credit cards because debt is evil, often announced by the same individuals who proudly rotate through 6 travel rewards cards like they're performing a Las Vegas card trick. The advice conflates responsible credit use with immediate financial doom, warning that borrowing even a single dollar guarantees a lifetime starring in commercials about debt relief. Meanwhile, these anti-credit crusaders frequently enjoy excellent credit scores built on decades of painless borrowing during a time when interest rates were low and wages weren't allergic to growth. Their cautionary tales about debt often sound like campfire ghost stories where the boogeyman is APR. Yet they conveniently forget their own decades of credit card cashback shopping sprees and the fact that modern renters often need credit just to rent an apartment the size of a walk-in humidifier. 13. The boomer notion that millennials should stop switching careers and pick one thing forever functions like an honorary fossil in the Museum of Impractical Advice, built on the idea that industries stay consistent and companies remain loyal despite millennial careers resembling extreme sports where entire professions collapse before lunch. The advisor usually paints career switching as aimless wandering rather than adaptive survival in a constantly shifting market shaped by automation, gig work, and corporate attention spans shorter than the runtime of a TikTok video. Meanwhile, they proudly recount their own stable decades-long job journey, conveniently ignoring that their industry wasn't replaced by software updates every 6 minutes. The insistence that millennials lack focus becomes especially rich coming from someone who changed jobs only when their company relocated across the street and offered unlimited donuts as incentive. 14. Some boomers fully believe that millennials could save enormous amounts of money by just mending clothes instead of buying new ones, suggesting a return to the time-honored tradition of darning socks and patching jeans, as though modern fabrics aren't designed to disintegrate the moment they sense financial anxiety. They speak nostalgically about sewing machines and durable denim while ignoring the capitalism-fueled reality that most contemporary clothing is constructed from a blend of dust, static electricity, and hopes too fragile to withstand a single spin cycle. The charming idea that clothing repairs build character feels less inspirational when confronted with garments engineered to self-destruct like spy gadgets after minimal use. Yet the advisor perseveres, insisting millennials would thrive with needle and thread, blissfully overlooking that the cost of a sewing kit now rivals the monthly payment on a used hatchback. 15. The timeless command to stop spending money on vacations and focus on responsibilities often comes from boomers who spent their youth backpacking through Europe, taking cross-country road trips with gas priced like bargain bin candy, and enjoying cheap flights not requiring a background check, a ransom, and 3 forms of ID. They now treat travel as a forbidden luxury, insisting millennials should save every dime instead of experiencing anything outside the radius of their workplace commute. The irony grows deeper when the advisor proudly displays souvenirs from global adventures, all acquired during a time when travel didn't cost 2 months' rent and a portion of one's sanity. The expectation that millennials remain joyless productivity machines becomes even funnier when paired with boomer retirement photos featuring beaches, cruises, and tropical drinks held by people who insist those same experiences are financial irresponsibility when enjoyed by anyone under 50. 16. Declaring that millennials should stop complaining and just get a starter car, nothing fancy, usually comes from someone who bought their first vehicle for the price of a modern phone charger, all while forgetting that starter cars today either burst into flames when the engine reaches room temperature or cost more than the average annual salary. They recount tales of reliable old sedans that ran for decades on a diet of oil changes and blind optimism, ignoring that those models now exist only in vintage car blogs and the fond hallucinations of people who swear everything used to be built better. Meanwhile, they insist millennials are too picky, as if choosing not to buy a 19-year-old minivan with a dashboard held together by prayer is some kind of generational failing, turning basic transportation into a moral test. Millennials apparently keep failing simply by wanting brakes that work. 17. Nothing spotlights boomer logic like insisting millennials should learn to live without air conditioning because nobody needed it back in the day, a statement delivered with the serene confidence of someone who apparently slept through every summer heat wave like a dehydrated lizard on a rock. This advice is usually paired with fond stories of windows that created perfect cross breezes, conveniently ignoring that modern summers now feel like living inside a malfunctioning oven and that humidity alone could qualify as a psychological weapon. Still, the boomer insists young people are weak for not wanting to work, sleep, and exist inside a sauna powered entirely by atmospheric cruelty, as though sweat-soaked survival is a cornerstone of fiscal responsibility, rather than a solid argument for leaving Earth entirely. Meanwhile, the advisor enjoys central air today because it's different when you're older, transforming climate control into a generational privilege rather than a basic attempt to remain alive. 18. Some boomers swear by the spiritual power of coupons, insisting millennials could save mountains of money by clipping tiny rectangles of expired hope from newspapers that barely exist anymore, as if fiscal destiny hinges on gathering enough perforated scraps to summon a grocery store discount spirit. They speak passionately about coupon binders, coupon strategies, and coupon tournaments that sound suspiciously like events hosted inside casino basements, while ignoring that modern stores have replaced most deals with apps that demand loyalty accounts, facial recognition, and 3 security questions just to get 10 cents off toothpaste. Still, the advice giver swears that coupons built empires, as though entire retirement accounts sprouted directly from half-price frozen lasagna, creating a mythology where savings rain from the heavens onto the righteous and the couponless are doomed to financial purgatory forever. 19. Advising millennials to stop buying new phones, the old ones still work, reveals a touching faith in technology functioning out of sheer willpower, as though smartphones are powered by moral discipline instead of lithium batteries that age like dairy products left in a parked car. The boomer offering this gem often carries a flip phone that has survived multiple political administrations, 2 divorces, and at least 1 accidental trip through a washing machine. Believing this indestructible relic proves modern devices are unnecessary luxuries. Meanwhile, millennials juggle apps, work software, banking, security keys, and the occasional attempt at maintaining a social life, all while being told the solution is to simply live like it's 2004 and communicate through cryptic voicemail messages nobody checks. The whole suggestion becomes a charming tribute to technological denial, where progress is optional and inconvenience is character building. 20. The financial parable that millennials should never hire help, do everything yourself, and save money always comes from someone who hasn't assembled furniture in 30 years and once fixed a leaky faucet by hitting it with a wrench until it gave up. They insist outsourcing tasks is decadent, ignoring that many home repairs now require specialized tools, or at least a passing familiarity with electricity, water pressure, and not dying. Their stories usually involve miraculous DIY feats achieved through instinct and leftover materials found in garages that function like archaeological digs, as if millennials simply lack the will to rebuild their apartments from the studs up. Meanwhile, modern renters face restrictions against so much as replacing a light switch without triggering a legal ritual involving their landlord and possibly a priest, turning the DIY ethos into a nostalgic fantasy rather than practical advice for a generation with neither space nor permission to experiment with power tools. 21. A boomer insisting that millennials should marry young to save money turns romance into an economic strategy worthy of a Wall Street fever dream, as if love is primarily a coupon for shared rent and tax benefits rather than a life-altering commitment occasionally involving therapy, compromise, and a surprising number of mismatched expectations. They nostalgically reference an era when people married at 19, bought a home at 20, and resented each other quietly for the next several decades, confidently portraying this as a financially savvy blueprint instead of a sociological cautionary tale. Meanwhile, millennials navigate dating markets that resemble escape rooms designed by sleep-deprived comedians, where commitment requires negotiations comparable to international treaties and weddings cost more than used hatchbacks. Yet boomers treat marriage like a simple bulk discount, two humans for the price of one, completely oblivious to the modern reality that combining bank accounts often produces flames rather than savings. 22. The classic admonition to stop buying avocado toast continues, appearing with the persistence of an unkillable myth, cheerfully suggesting that brunch is the primary force preventing millennials from storming the real estate market. This miraculous food item is treated like a financial supervillain, apparently single-handedly wielding enough economic power to suppress wages, inflate housing prices, and ruin entire retirement strategies with one buttery swipe. The boomer delivering this revelation usually believes each slice costs roughly the same as a used jet ski and carries the moral weight of a frivolous sin that alerts the IRS. Meanwhile, millennials consume avocado toast not as an intentional middle-class sabotage ritual, but as an occasional treat to remain emotionally functional while navigating interest rates that behave like caffeinated squirrels. Yet the boomer insists that abstaining from this green garnish unlocks instant homeownership, turning breakfast into a national scapegoat. 23. Another boomer classic, just stop traveling and save your money, treats experiences as frivolous indulgences rather than the one thing preventing millennials from mentally dissolving into dust after years of economic turbulence. The advice often comes from individuals who spent their youth exploring continents with pocket change, cheap hostels, and airline tickets priced like novelty items. Now baffled that millennials don't enjoy the same logistical miracles, they frame travel as irresponsible escapism, conveniently ignoring the scrapbook of global adventures they accumulated before wages stagnated and living costs performed a triple backflip into chaos. Meanwhile, modern travelers face airfare that eats savings whole, and hotels that charge extra for things like breathing near the minibar. Yet boomers still insist that wanderlust is a sign of financial immaturity, reducing the entire world to a budgetary inconvenience rather than a source of perspective. 24. Suggesting millennials grow their own food to save money imagines a pastoral utopia where everyone possesses land, time, soil quality, and the spiritual blessing of a kindly garden deity, while forgetting that most millennials live in apartments the size of large storage closets, where the closest thing to a yard is the fire escape they're legally forbidden to stand on. Boomers offer visions of abundant homegrown vegetables, ignoring that modern produce prices might be cheaper than buying gardening supplies that now cost as much as small medical procedures. Meanwhile, the expectation that millennials become part-time farmers is delivered casually, as though soil simply appears when summoned, seeds sprout out of respect, and pests politely avoid entering gardens grown by the virtuous. The entire fantasy treats agriculture like a budgeting trick instead of a craft requiring sunlight, space, and skills that don't come pre-installed with adulthood. 25. Boomers love proclaiming that millennials should shop garage sales for everything, imagining a treasure-filled wonderland where vintage goods practically beg to be purchased, while ignoring that many garage sales today consist of mismatched mugs, broken blenders, and relics from the great plastic explosion of 1993. They insist millennials lack the drive to hunt for bargains, forgetting that time is also a resource and sifting through 47 boxes of forgotten trinkets isn't always feasible for people holding multiple jobs. The boomer recounts tales of finding entire furniture sets for $5 and a handshake, blissfully unaware that modern yard sales often charge premium prices for items that smell faintly like basement regret. Meanwhile, the advice frames thrift shopping as a moral imperative rather than a sometimes useful option, treating millennials like unruly treasure hunters refusing to embark on a noble quest for discounted spoons. 26. The advice that millennials should just save half their income is spoken with a confidence so bold it could power small cities, as though wages haven't remained frozen in time while costs sprint laps around them. Boomers speak as if the math itself bends out of respect for discipline, ignoring that half of a millennial's income often disappears into rent before utilities even enter the chat. They reminisce about eras when saving half one's paycheck was possible because expenses were low and employers regularly granted raises instead of inspirational posters. Yet they present this suggestion like a universal truth, turning financial delusion into a performance art piece where numbers exist purely as symbolic gestures rather than measurable quantities. It becomes a budgeting fantasy, built on a world that hasn't existed since rotary phones were cutting-edge technology. 27. A boomer instructing millennials to stop buying new clothes every season imagines a generation strutting around shopping malls like hyperactive fashion influencers, oblivious to the fact that most millennials cling to their clothes until the fabric reaches a state of dignified despair. Boomers recall an era when wardrobes were small but durable, completely ignoring that modern clothing is engineered with the structural integrity of wet paper towels and begins fraying the moment it senses human hope. They accuse millennials of vanity while overlooking the fact that workplaces often impose dress codes requiring outfits that don't look like they survived a bear attack. Meanwhile, the advice assumes clothes shopping is a major hobby instead of a semi-annual crisis when socks suddenly develop more holes than the federal budget. The entire critique becomes an accidental roast of the garment industry rather than the generation supposedly overspending on sweaters. 28. Offering the advice to move somewhere cheaper is essentially the boomer equivalent of suggesting that teleportation exists, spoken with breezy confidence as though cheap cities are just sitting there, unbothered and welcoming, with open arms and large apartments priced like discounted gum. They forget that remote work isn't universal, relocation costs money, and many cheap areas are cheap precisely because wages there are allergic to upward movement. Boomers talk as if millennials can simply uproot everything, including friends, family, jobs, healthcare access, and mental stability, as casually as rearranging furniture. Meanwhile, they champion mythical places where cost of living has remained untouched by inflation, ignoring that these affordable enclaves often require commuting distances typically measured in geological epochs. Their vision of relocation functions less like practical guidance and more like a bedtime story about imaginary towns where financial gravity doesn't apply. 29. Insisting that millennials should never buy coffee outside the house turns caffeination into a national moral failing, delivered as though coffee shops are covert agents destabilizing the economy one latte at a time. Boomers depict homemade coffee as both cheaper and spiritually superior, conveniently forgetting that their own generation popularized entire kitchen gadgets dedicated to brewing devices with names like Percolator Supreme Deluxe. Meanwhile, millennials aren't sipping overpriced drinks for decadence, but to maintain enough consciousness to function through commutes, meetings, and the general threat of existing in 2025. Yet the advice frames coffee as a reckless extravagance rather than a momentary break from chaos, treating every purchase as a dramatic betrayal of long-term financial integrity, turning caffeine into the villain of an economic myth that refuses to die. 30. The boomer mantra that millennials should stop upgrading their computers. They last for years reveals a charming obliviousness to the modern software ecosystem, where updates arrive faster than existential dread, and half of them render old devices about as functional as ornamental bricks. They recall a simpler time when computers weighed as much as microwaves and lasted longer than marriages, ignoring that today's programs demand hardware power on par with small space probes. Their confidence in outdated machines persists even as millennials attempt to run essential applications on devices that wheeze like asthmatic harmonicas. Meanwhile, the suggestion treats technology like a durable household appliance instead of a constantly evolving requirement for work, communication, and basic survival, turning digital obsolescence into a philosophical disagreement rather than the practical nightmare it actually is. 31. Boomers encouraging millennials to stop being picky and take any job. Imagine labor markets as bustling bazaars overflowing with opportunity, where anyone can stroll in, select a career from a cheerful assortment, and joyfully skip into stability. They ignore hiring processes involving automated resume scanners, personality tests, video interviews conducted by AI, holograms, and competition fiercer than gladiator arenas. They frame millennials' reluctance as entitlement instead of awareness that low-wage jobs often fail to cover basic expenses, creating a financial paradox where working full-time still results in poverty. Meanwhile, the boomer fondly recalls landing their first job by walking into a shop, shaking hands, and promising not to steal office supplies, transforming employment into a nostalgic fairy tale rather than the high-stakes bureaucratic labyrinth it has become for anyone born after 1980. And that's the grand tour of boomer financial wisdom, equal parts comedy and chaos. Drop your favorite ridiculous advice below. Vote on the dumbest one. And sure, like and subscribe for more madness.